Okay, let's unpack this. Intermittent fasting. It's absolutely everywhere right now, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. You can't really avoid hearing about it.
Scrolling through social media, flipping through magazines, hearing friends talk about what window they're eating in. It's definitely become one of the biggest health trends, period.
It's truly captured public imagination. And, well, when something gets this popular, people naturally start wondering, does it actually live up to the buzz?
Exactly. We see the headlines, we hear the stories from friends,
Mm.
but beyond all that, what does the actual science say about intermittent fasting? Like, is there solid research backing it up, or is it mostly just hype?
That's really the core question, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's our mission in this deep dive. We're trying to
Yeah.
cut through all that noise and get straight to what the research tells us.
And to do that, we've pulled together, well, quite a collection of reputable sources. We've got insights from narrative reviews published in scientific journals, perspectives from major medical institutions like Johns Hopkins Medicine, the Cleveland Clinic, UC Davis Health, and even Harvard Health Publishing.
So we're looking at a pretty broad range of information here,
Mm.
covering everything from the absolute basics of what IF is, maybe where the ID even came from, to the really fascinating ways scientists think it works inside your body.
Right, the mechanisms, and then the potential benefits reported in studies, and also, crucially, the stuff about who should be careful, maybe even avoid it entirely.
And sort of where the research currently stands, what questions are still out there.
Our goal for you today is really to distill the essential information from all these sources, help you understand the different ways people approach it, grasp what potential advantages the research suggests.
But also know the really important warnings and see what researchers are still trying to figure out. Think of this as your ultimate shortcut, maybe, to understanding intermittent fasting, but grounded completely in the science presented in the material we've gathered. No fads here, just the key insights based on the evidence.
So let's dive in.
Absolutely. So, okay, let's unpack this, starting with the most fundamental question. What exactly is intermittent fasting? Because while it's super trendy now, the sources show it's a pretty specific concept.
That's right. Intermittent fasting, or EF, isn't your typical diet that focuses only on what specific foods you eat. Its core principle, as you'll see defined in the sources, is really about when you eat.
Oh, hit the timing.
Yeah, it's an eating pattern that involves voluntarily alternating between periods where you consume food and distinct periods where you don't. And this follows a regular schedule.
Right, not just random.
Not random at all. And this is quite different from the common pattern you see in many modern societies, particularly places like the US, where people often eat, pretty frequently throughout their waking hours. From breakfast right after waking up, maybe snacks, lunch, more snacks, dinner, maybe even late night snacks.
So it's structured timing, not just randomly skipping lunch because you're busy.
Precisely. And it's really crucial to understand that this fasting we're talking about is voluntary abstinence. It's not involuntary starvation. The sources make that distinction very clear.
Okay, important difference. It's a choice for health or other reasons, not a lack of food.
Correct.
Got it. And how does this timing idea compare to just, eating fewer calories overall every single day? Because that's the traditional way people try to lose weight or improve metabolic health, isn't it? Continuous calorie restriction.
Yes, traditionally, continuous caloric restriction, just cutting back your total daily calorie intake consistently. That's been the standard advice for weight management
Yeah.
and tackling metabolic issues. And I mean, it works.
Sure, if you can stick to it.
Right. And that's the catch. The sources note that sticking to daily calorie restriction can be really challenging for people long term. So intermittent fasting has kind of emerged as an alternative approach.
An alternative strategy.
Exactly. And while it often does lead to eating fewer calories overall, simply because you have less time to eat, its main focus is really on the timing of meals and the metabolic shifts that happen during those fasting periods. There's a thought it might offer benefits beyond just the calorie cutting itself.
That makes sense. It
Yeah.
feels like a different way to frame it, a different way to approach reducing intake, maybe. And the sources also mentioned this isn't some brand new invention, right?
Huh.
It has historical roots.
That's an interesting point the sources highlight, yeah. Fasting for health or spiritual reasons isn't new at all. It's been part of human practice for centuries, integrated into many religious traditions.
Like Ramadan.
Like Ramadan fasting, for example. That involves daytime fasting for about 15 hours a day for a whole month, and the sources mention studies looking at its health impacts. So the basic concept of giving the body periods without food, it has a really long history.
So the basic idea, boiled down, is that by consciously creating these periods without food, you're changing something fundamental about how your body operates compared to constantly fueling it minute by minute.
Exactly. The underlying principle is that these fasting intervals give your body a break from constantly processing incoming calories. It encourages your system to, well, tap into its existing energy stores instead.
Which I assume primarily means fat stores.
Yes, precisely. It's hypothesized to help the body become more efficient at using that stored fat for fuel when the readily available stuff runs out.
Okay, so the fundamental concept, timed eating, creating periods without food to utilize fat stores. But how does this actually work inside the body? What's the science behind these fasting periods doing? This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
It absolutely does. The core physiological process the sources describe is often referred to as the metabolic switch. Think of your body as having two main fuel tanks.
Okay.
One has the readily available sugar from the food you just ate, that's glucose, which gets stored in small amounts as glycogen. The other tank is your stored body fat.
Like the main gas tank versus the reserve tank in a car.
Something like that, yeah. When you're constantly eating, your body mostly runs on the glucose that's easy to access from that first tank. Your liver and muscles store a bit of this glucose as glycogen, but it's a limited supply.
Right, it doesn't last forever.
No. After several hours without food, typically somewhere around 10 to 12 hours, maybe a bit more or less depending on the person and activity level, those glycogen stores start to get pretty low. At this point, your body needs another energy source.
And it flips the switch.
It switches, to breaking down stored fat from that reserve tank. That's the metabolic switch.
The switch from burning sugar to burning fat.
That's the essence of it. And as your body breaks down this fat for energy, a byproduct is the creation of molecules called ketones, primarily in the liver. These ketones are then released into your bloodstream and can be used as fuel by many tissues, including your brain.
And Mark Matson's is a researcher often mentioned in this context.
Yes, he's a neuroscientist cited in the sources who has done a lot of work explaining and researching this concept of metabolic switching.
Okay. And is this different from just being on, say, a keto diet, a very low-carb diet? Because that also involves ketones, right?
That's a good question. While low-carb or ketogenic diets also lead to ketone production, they do it primarily by drastically limiting the intake of carbohydrates, the source of glucose. Intermittent fasting achieves ketosis, or at least increased ketone levels, by depleting the readily available glucose stores first through the fasting period itself.
So it's the absence of food for a period, not just the absence of carbs.
Right. The sources highlight that if you're eating frequently throughout the day, meals plus snacks, your body generally doesn't get a chance to fully deplete those glycogen stores and make that robust switch over to significant fat burning and ketone production. Prolonging the fasted state is what really pushes your body into that mode more reliably.
And you mentioned ketones aren't just fuel.
Correct. The sources emphasize this. Ketones seem to be more than just an alternative energy source. They appear to have important signaling roles within the body and especially the brain.
Signaling roles, like telling cells to do things.
Kind of, yeah. Some research suggests they can protect memory and learning functions and could potentially play a role in slowing down age-related changes or even disease processes in the brain.
Wow. Okay. So it's not just about burning fat for energy. It's about producing these signaling molecules that might have other beneficial effects, especially for the brain. That's fascinating. The sources also dig deeper into what's happening right down at the cellular level during fasting. What's the deep dive there?
This is where the potential benefits get really interesting from a biological perspective. Inside your cells, you have these complex communication networks, these pathways that sense how many nutrients are available. Think of them like internal monitors.
Nutrient sensors, checking if the fridge is full.
Exactly, something like that. When you're in the fed state, with plenty of glucose and amino acids coming in, certain pathways are active that basically tell the cell, okay, resources are abundant, let's grow, let's build, let's divide. A key player here is a pathway often called mTOR. It signals the cell to synthesize proteins and grow.
So mTOR is like the build mode switch.
You could think of it that way. But during the fasting state, which the cell perceives as a period of mild, maybe even beneficial, stress, kind of like the healthy stress you put on your muscles during exercise, these nutrient sensors trigger different pathways.
The stress response pathway.
Yes, stress-responsive pathways get activated. And importantly, this activation tends to suppress those growth-promoting pathways like mTOR.
So the cell hits the brakes on growth and building when food is scarce.
Pretty much. And at the same time, other crucial processes get switched on. One of the most significant is called autophagy.
Autophagy. I've heard that term. It's like cellular cleaning.
That's a great way to put it. Autophagy is essentially the cell's internal recycling and cleanup crew. It identifies damaged components like misfolded proteins or worn-out little organelles inside the cell, breaks them down into their basic building blocks, and recycles the usable pieces.
The ultimate cellular spring cleaning, getting rid of the junk.
Precisely. By stimulating autophagy, fasting helps the cell clear out accumulated damage and basically refresh itself. This is thought to be really important for maintaining cellular health and function, especially as we age.
So it helps keep the cells running smoothly.
That's the idea. And besides autophagy, activating these stress-responsive pathways also seems to boost the cell's own defense mechanisms. Defenses against things that cause damage, like oxidative stress, you can think of that as cellular rust and inflammation.
Ah, so it makes the cell tougher too.
Exactly. The sources propose that this whole coordinated response, shifting away from growth signals towards cleanup, repair, and building up defenses, promotes cellular rejuvenation and makes the cells more resilient against future stress.
So that analogy really holds up, like exercising a muscle makes it stronger. Putting the cell under this temporary controlled stress of fasting seems to encourage it to repair itself and become more robust.
That's the concept presented in the sources, yes. This adaptive response, where a mild stressor actually leads to beneficial adaptations, is a biological principle sometimes called hormesis. And the cellular effects of fasting described seem to fit neatly into that model. The cell gets a chance to clean house, fix things, and bolster its defenses during the fasting period.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. Now, the sources also bring up another layer. The body's internal clock, the circadian rhythm, and how IF might interact with that.
Yes, this is another fascinating and currently very active area of research. Our bodies operate on these internal biological clocks called circadian rhythms. They regulate countless processes over a roughly 24-hour cycle.
Like sleep-wake cycles.
Yes, but also things like hormone release, body temperature, alertness levels, and importantly for this discussion, how our metabolism functions throughout the day and night. There's a master clock in the brain kind of coordinating things.
In the brain.
But most tissues and organs in your body, like your liver, your gut, even your fat cells, have their own peripheral clocks. And these peripheral clocks can be influenced by external cues, including significantly when you eat.
Ah, so the timing of our meals can actually talk to these internal clocks in our organs.
That's the hypothesis, particularly for intermittent fasting plans that restrict eating to specific windows, especially if those windows align with our typical daytime hours when humans are naturally most active. The idea is that by eating only during a consistent daily window, you might help synchronize all these clocks, the master clock in the brain and the peripheral clocks throughout your body.
And why is synchronization important?
Well, this synchronization is thought to optimize metabolic processes. Things like how efficiently we use energy, how we store or burn fat, how sensitive we are to insulin. These might all work better when all our internal clocks are ticking in harmony.
And the sources use shift work as an example of what happens when things get out of sync.
Right. That's a key piece of evidence highlighted. People who do shift work often have to eat, sleep, and be active at times that clash with their body's natural circadian rhythm. And studies consistently show they have a higher risk of metabolic problems, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease.
So disrupting the clock clearly has negative health consequences.
It strongly suggests that timing matters. Eating at the wrong time of day relative to your body's internal programming can mess up your metabolism. Conversely, some research suggests that eating the majority of your calories earlier in the day is associated with better weight management and health outcomes.
So that common habit of eating a large meal late at night might be problematic, specifically because it clashes with our body's natural rhythm for winding down.
That's exactly the hypothesis the sources discuss. Eating meals at what are considered abnormal circadian times, especially late at night, could desynchronize your internal clocks, potentially disrupting sleep patterns and metabolic function. Intermittent fasting, particularly time-restricted eating that confines meals to daylight hours, might exert some of its benefits by helping to realign these clocks.
Okay, so IFT could potentially help get our internal clocks back on track, especially by encouraging us to avoid that late-night eating. There's one more piece to this how it works puzzle mentioned in the sources, our gut microbes.
Yes, the gut microbiota, the trillions of bacteria and other microorganisms living in our digestive system. We're learning more and more about how crucial they are for our overall health.
They affect digestion, obviously, but much more than that, right?
Oh, much more. They influence our metabolism, how we absorb energy from food, the development and function of our immune system, levels of inflammation throughout the body. It's incredibly complex.
And how does intermittent fasting potentially fit into the gut health picture?
Well, the sources note that even basic gut functions, things like how quickly your stomach empties, blood flow to the intestines, how your body handles a glucose load after a meal, these seem to have their own daily rhythms, potentially linked to those circadian clocks we just talked about.
So the gut has its own daily schedule, too.
It seems so. And the hypothesis is that chronically disrupting your body's overall rhythms, perhaps through erratic eating patterns or shift work, could impair these gut functions.
Okay, that makes sense.
Furthermore, the sources propose that intermittent fasting might directly influence the composition and activity of the gut microbiota itself. We know that changes in the types and balance of gut bugs are linked to conditions like obesity and chronic inflammation.
So fasting could change the neighborhood down there.
Potentially, yes. They even mention research linking jet lag, which is another classic example of circadian disruption, to unhealthy shifts in the gut microbiota in both mice and humans. These shifts were associated with problems like glucose intolerance and obesity. This really points to a complex interplay between when you eat, your internal clocks, and the health and function of your gut ecosystem.
Wow. Okay, so it's this really intricate dance going on inside us. It involves switching fuel sources, triggering cellular cleanup and repair, potentially aligning with our body's natural daily rhythms, and maybe even influencing the bacteria in our gut. It's definitely a lot more involved than just skipping breakfast.
It really is a multifaceted biological process, and researchers are still actively working to fully understand all the intricate connections and downstream effects.
Okay, so we've explored some of the really cool how behind intermittent fasting based on the science presented in these sources. But how do people actually do this in real life? The sources make it pretty clear there isn't just one single right way to do IF.
That's absolutely correct. The sources describe several different common approaches, and they emphasize that the best one often comes down to what fits an individual's lifestyle, their preferences, and crucially, what they can realistically stick with long term. They detail the most common methods that have been studied.
Right, sustainability is key. Let's start with time-restricted feeding, or TRF. That seems to be incredibly popular right now.
Yes, TRF is probably the most widely practiced form of IF. The basic idea is simple. You set a specific number of hours each day during which you allow yourself to eat. That's your eating window. And then you fast for the remaining hours of the day.
Like the classic 168 method everyone talks about. Eat for 8 hours, fast for 16.
Exactly. The 168 approach is very common. That means a 16-hour fasting period and an 8-hour eating window. Another popular variation mentioned is 1410, which gives you a slightly longer 10-hour eating window and a 14-hour fast.
And why do people seem to find this approach maybe easier to adopt than some others?
Well, the sources suggest its popularity stems largely from the fact that it naturally incorporates your overnight sleep into the fasting period. You're already fasting for, say, 7 to 9 hours while you sleep anyway.
Ah, so you're getting a head start on the fast.
Precisely. TRF simply involves extending that natural overnight fast. You can do this either by skipping or delaying your first meal of the day, usually breakfast, or by finishing your last meal, dinner, earlier in the evening and not eating afterwards.
So, for example, you might just skip breakfast entirely and have your first meal at noon, then stop eating by 8 p.m. That gives you your 8-hour window and 16-hour fast.
That's a very common 168 schedule. Or someone might eat earlier, say from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., achieving the same 168 split but shifted earlier in the day. There's flexibility there.
And do the sources offer any specific tips for making TRF work well?
Yes, they do offer a couple of practical points. One suggestion is to try and plan your eating window so that your fast begins at least 3 hours before you typically go to bed.
Okay, avoid eating right before sleep.
Right. And they also strongly highlight the importance of avoiding or at least limiting nighttime snacking. This isn't just about extending the fast duration, but also because those late night snacks are often, let's face it, high in calories, low in nutrients, and can spike your blood sugar right before you sleep, which might interfere with some of the benefits.
Yeah, that habitual late-night kitchen raid. It's a tough one for many people. What about the actual research on TRF in humans? Does it back up the hype?
The sources indicate that human studies specifically on TRF are still somewhat limited compared to the really extensive body of animal research, particularly in rodents.
So mice seem to love TRF.
While the animal studies have often shown quite significant metabolic benefits from TRF protection against obesity, improved insulin sensitivity, better lipid profiles, even when the TRF mice ate the same total number of calories as control mice who ate whenever they wanted. This really points towards the timing of food intake being a powerful factor, at least in these animal models.
Interesting. Even with the same calories, what about people?
The human data, while described as more limited, is presented as promising. Some studies mentioned in the sources show benefits like reductions in body weight, improvements in fasting glucose levels, and better lipid profiles, things like cholesterol and triglycerides. One study specifically noted a significant difference in weight change, favoring people who maintained a nightly fast of 11 hours or more.
So even just ensuring that overnight fast is consistently longer might make a difference.
That's what some of the early human evidence suggests, yes. But the sources are clear that more robust, longer-term human studies are definitely needed to confirm these findings and understand the nuances.
Okay, so TRF is all about setting those daily timing windows. What about the approaches that involve fasting on certain days but not others?
Right, those generally fall under the umbrella of modified fasting regimes. A key feature here is that they don't usually involve complete abstinence from food on the fasting days. Instead, they call for a severe restriction of calories on those scheduled days.
How severe?
Typically around 20 to 25% of your usual daily energy needs. For many people, this often translates to about 500 to 600 calories on those specific fasting days.
And the most well-known version of this is probably the 5.2 diet.
Yes, the 5.2 diet is the prime example cited. The structure is you eat a normal, healthy diet on 5 days of the week. These don't have to be consecutive. And then on the other 2 fasting days, you restrict your intake down to that 500, 600 calorie level.
Each specific low-calorie days per week.
Correct. And the sources add a useful tip for those restricted days. Focus on foods that are high in fiber and protein. These tend to be more satiating, helping you feel fuller and manage hunger better on significantly fewer calories.
Makes sense. And what does the research show for 5.2 or similar modified fasting plans?
The sources summarize findings from several studies involving overweight and obese adults using this kind of approach. Across various trials, typically lasting from about 8 weeks up to 6 months, most showed statistically significant weight loss. The amount varied, but typically ranged from around 3% up to 8% of initial body weight.
So it can definitely lead to weight loss. What about other health markers?
Some studies also found improvements in metabolic health indicators. Things like lower fasting insulin levels, suggesting better insulin sensitivity, and some improvements in blood sugar control. Results regarding cholesterol and other lipids were noted as being a bit mixed across studies. However, there were also reports of reductions in certain inflammatory markers.
Interesting. There were also mentions of mood effects.
Yes, mood effects were mixed. Some participants reported negative side effects like feeling cold, irritable, or hungry on fasting days, though usually only a small percentage. But overall, some studies actually showed mean improvements in mood scores, things like reduced tension, anger, and fatigue, and increased self-confidence and positive mood.
So potentially some mood benefits after adjustment for some people. How does this modified fasting compare to just straightforward daily calorie cutting?
That's a key comparison. The sources mentioned 3 trials that directly compared modified fasting to continuous daily energy restriction. In only one of those did the fasting group lose significantly more weight. Generally, reviews cited suggest that modified fasting produces comparable reductions in weight, visceral fat, insulin levels, and insulin resistance when compared to traditional continuous calorie restriction, assuming the overall calorie deficit achieved is similar over time.
So again, it seems like an alternative way to achieve that crucial calorie deficit rather than necessarily being superior in its effects.
That seems to be the general consensus from the comparative studies presented, yes. It's another tool in the toolbox for calorie reduction that might suit some people's preferences or schedules better than daily restriction.
Got it. So it's another valid path to potentially achieve calorie reduction and its associated benefits. Now, what about alternate day fasting, or ADF? That one sounds like it might be the most challenging approach.
ADF is definitely another distinct approach discussed in the sources. The most classic form involves strictly alternating between fasting days, where you consume essentially 0 calories, and eating days, where you eat ad libitum, meaning you can eat freely as much as you want. Some variations allow a very small number of calories, similar to the modified fasting days, around 20–25% of needs, on the fasting days.
0 calories one day, eat normally the next, repeat. That does sound tough. What have studies found on ADF in humans?
The sources note that human studies on strict ADF, especially the 0 calorie version, are actually quite limited. They often involve small numbers of participants and relatively short durations, maybe just a few weeks.
Okay, so less data here.
Right. These limited studies have shown some modest weight loss. One study reported a mean loss of about 2.5% over several weeks. They also generally found significant decreases in at least one marker related to glucose regulation, like fasting insulin.
What about lipids? Cholesterol?
Results on lipids were again noted as being mixed or inconsistent. Some studies saw improvements in good HDL cholesterol, or triglycerides, but one study specifically reported an increase in LDL cholesterol, the bad kind, with ADF. Some reductions in inflammatory markers were also observed in some trials.
That increase in LDL is definitely something that would make you pause and want more information.
Absolutely. And the sources included a specific cautionary tale from one ADF study where participants who followed the pattern for 6 months had significantly elevated LDL levels even 6 months after they had stopped the diet. This really highlights the need for long-term perspective and careful monitoring, especially regarding lipids with this approach.
That's very important long-term finding. And how did people actually feel doing ADF? Was it sustainable? Could they stick with it?
That seems to be a major hurdle. One study mentioned specifically noted that participants reported considerable hunger on the fasting days, and importantly, this hunger did not seem to decrease or get easier to manage over the course of the study. This naturally raises serious questions about the real-world feasibility and long-term sustainability of strict alternate day fasting for most people.
If you're miserably hungry every other day, that's probably not a lifestyle change you'll maintain.
Likely not for many, no.
Oh.
And related to sustainability and effectiveness, the sources bring up another crucial point, this time from a mouse study on ADF.
What did the mice show?
In the study, if the mice significantly overate on their non-fasting eating days to the point where they compensated for the calories missed on fast days and didn't actually end up in a calorie deficit or lose weight, then they did not get the other potential health benefits seen in fasting mice that did reduce overall calories, like increased lifespan or delayed tumor growth.
The overcompensation trap again. If you just binge on your on days, you might wipe out any benefits.
Precisely. It strongly reinforced the idea that achieving an overall calorie reduction seems to be a key factor driving many of the benefits. And if a particular fasting pattern just leads to compensatory gorging, it might not be beneficial at all and could potentially even backfire.
That's a critical takeaway. Don't assume fasting days give you a free pass to eat junk on other days. Finally, there's one more approach mentioned. Eat, stop, eat.
Yes, eat, stop, eat is described quite simply. You practice a complete 24-hour fast, usually once or twice per week.
So like finish dinner on Monday and don't eat again until dinner on Tuesday.
Exactly that kind of pattern. Fasting from lunch one day to lunch the next would be another example. A full 24 hours without food, done intermittently through the week.
And the sources suggest the side effects with this one can be quite intense, potentially more so than other methods.
Yes, they do note that. Potential side effects listed can include significant fatigue, bad headaches, irritability, intense hunger pangs, overall low energy levels, and even sensitivity to temperature changes. It's generally presented as a more challenging pattern for many people to follow compared to, say, TRF or even 5.2.
Okay, so we have this whole spectrum of approaches, really,
Yeah.
from adjusting daily eating windows with TRF to having a couple of very low-calorie days per week with 5.2 to the more intense alternate day or full 24-hour fasts. Now let's get to the part everyone really wants to know. What are the potential benefits? What does the research as presented in these sources suggest people might actually gain from trying intermittent fasting? Is it the health silver bullet some people seem to claim?
Well, the sources definitely lay out a range of potential benefits that have been observed in studies or hypothesized based on the mechanisms, but it's really important to look closely at what the current human evidence, with all its acknowledged limitations, actually supports. We need to manage expectations based on the data.
Absolutely. Let's start with the biggest one, the reason many people try it, weight loss.
Right. Weight management is undeniably a primary motivator for many people trying IF. And the sources confirm that, yes, intermittent fasting can lead to weight loss. Studies involving overweight and obese individuals consistently show reductions in body weight.
How much weight loss typically?
The amount observed in trials varies depending on the study, the IF method used, and the duration, but it typically ranges from maybe 1.3% up to around 8 or 10% of initial body weight over periods of several weeks to months.
And why does it work for weight loss? Is it magic or just calories?
The sources primarily attribute the weight loss to the fact that for most people, restricting eating to a smaller window, like in TRF, or having designated low-calorie or no-calorie days, like 5.2 or ADF, naturally leads to consuming fewer calories overall throughout the week.
So fundamentally, it helps create that essential calorie deficit needed for weight loss.
Precisely. It's a strategy to reduce net energy intake. And the sources deliver a really, really important message here, something we touched on before but bears repeating. Weight loss from IF is highly unlikely if you simply pack your feeding times with high-calorie junk food, supersized fried items, and treats.
Right. You can't outfast a terrible diet during your eating window.
Exactly. This strongly emphasizes that the quality and the quantity of the food you choose to eat during your designated eating periods are still fundamentally important if AF isn't a magic permission slip to eat poorly.
That's a crucial reality check. And how does the amount of weight loss from IF compare to just standard continuous calorie restriction? Is AF better?
As we discussed when looking at the specific approaches like modified fasting, the sources indicate that studies directly comparing IF to continuous daily calorie restriction often show comparable amounts of weight loss and fat loss when the overall degree of calorie reduction is matched between the groups.
So, not necessarily superior for weight loss itself.
There isn't strong evidence presented in these sources to suggest that IF, whether it's TRF or modified fasting, produces superior weight loss compared to simply reducing daily calories consistently, assuming the total calorie deficit achieved over time is similar. It seems to function more as an alternative strategy to achieve that necessary calorie deficit, a strategy that might suit some people's preferences or lifestyles better than tracking calories daily.
Okay, so weight loss is possible, likely due to calorie reduction, but diet quality still matters hugely, and it's not necessarily better than standard dieting. Beyond just the number on the scale, what about effects on metabolic health? Things like blood sugar, insulin sensitivity, heart disease markers.
This is an area where the research, according to the sources we reviewed, shows quite a few promising findings, although consistency isn't perfect across all studies. Most studies indicate that intermittent fasting can lead to improvements in several key metabolic markers.
Such as?
This often includes decreasing fasting insulin concentrations, which suggest the body might be becoming more sensitive to insulin. Improvements in insulin sensitivity itself, often measured by an index called OMA-IR, are frequently reported, and many studies also show lower fasting blood glucose levels.
So potentially better blood sugar control overall.
That seems to be a consistent theme, yes, though as mentioned, some individual study results might vary. The general trend points towards potential benefits for glucose regulation.
And didn't the sources mention something quite striking about type 2 diabetes patients in some studies?
Yes, that was a significant point noted, stemming from certain studies, importantly, conducted under careful medical supervision, where some patients with type 2 diabetes were actually able to reduce or even completely eliminate their need for insulin therapy by following an intermittent fasting regimen.
Wow, that's potentially life-changing.
It really highlights a powerful potential benefit in that specific context. But it absolutely underscores, again, the critical need for close medical guidance and supervision, especially for anyone managing diabetes. You absolutely cannot try this on your own if you have diabetes, particularly if you're on medication.
Understood. Critical caveat there. What about factors related to heart health, cholesterol, blood pressure?
Findings on specific lipid markers like LDL, bad cholesterol, and HDL, good cholesterol, can be somewhat mixed across different IF studies and protocols. Some show improvements, others less so, and we saw that potential negative LDL finding with ADF. However, overall, IFF has been associated in various studies with improvements in other important cardiovascular risk factors.
Like blood pressure.
Yes, like lower blood pressure readings and also reductions in resting heart rates. It's also frequently noted that IF can decrease blood triglycerides, which is another type of fat in the blood linked to heart health.
Okay, so some positive signals for heart health markers, even if the cholesterol picture is a bit complex. And what about that inflammation link we discussed earlier with the cellular mechanisms? Does IF seem to help with that in humans?
Yes, the sources state that intermittent fasting has been shown in human studies to decrease systemic markers of inflammation, such as C-reactive protein, CRP, and TNF-alpha. It's also been shown to reduce markers of oxidative stress.
So calming down that background fire in the body.
That's the idea. This connection is considered particularly important because we know that chronic low-grade inflammation and oxidative stress are underlying factors contributing to obesity and the development of many chronic diseases, including heart disease and diabetes. So reducing these might be a key mechanism for broader health benefits.
It really seems to hit several pathways related to overall chronic disease risk then. What about effects on the brain? You mentioned earlier that ketones might help memory function.
Right. The sources do point to this as a potential benefit area. Animal studies, they note, have shown that IF can boost things like working memory and protect brain cells from damage or degeneration.
And in humans.
Human studies are fewer and often smaller, but some have indicated improvements, for instance, in verbal memory performance in adults following IF protocols. And that release of ketones during the fasted state is thought to be linked to this. As we discussed, ketones aren't just fuel. They seem to have neuroprotective signaling effects that might help preserve cognitive function as we age, or potentially slow disease processes in the brain. One source also specifically listed improved concentration as a potential benefit that people sometimes report.
Better memory and potentially better concentration. That sounds appealing. What about physical performance? Can you exercise effectively while doing IF?
There have been some studies looking at this. One study mentioned involved young men who practiced 16-hour daily fasts, the 168 method. They showed fat loss while managing to maintain their muscle mass, which is obviously desirable during weight loss. Animal studies, like in mice on alternate day fasting, have sometimes shown improvements in endurance capacity.
But maintaining muscle mass is a concern.
Yes, that's an important counterpoint mentioned. Weight loss resulting from any dietary intervention, including intermittent fasting, often comes with a potential downside: the loss of some lean body mass, meaning muscle, alongside the fat loss. This needs to be considered.
Okay, so actively working to preserve muscle, maybe through exercise, is important. Were there any other potential benefits listed across the various sources, sort of a grab bag?
Yes. Compiling the list from the different sources, other potential benefits mentioned here and there include possibly decreased appetite over time, potential improvements in gut health, linking back to the microbiota discussion, maybe some positive effects on the immune system, reports of better sleep quality, which could tie into the circadian rhythm aspect and avoiding late eating, and even some perspectives suggesting IF might decrease signs of aging, although that's likely based more on the cellular mechanism theories and animal data.
And maybe protection against certain diseases.
Ooh, yes. Based on broader research reviews and animal studies, potential protection against conditions like inflammatory bowel disease and possibly even many types of cancer were mentioned as areas of interest and ongoing research, though human evidence for these outcomes is still preliminary. Also, animal studies suggested IF might reduce tissue damage during surgery and improve outcomes.
Okay, that is quite a wide array of potential positives that researchers are looking into. But we absolutely need to look at the other side of the coin now. It's clearly not suitable for everyone, and there are definite potential downsides and risks involved. Who should really think twice, or perhaps outright avoid trying intermittent fasting, according to these sources?
This is arguably the most critical section, and the sources are very, very clear on this point. Intermittent fasting is not safe or appropriate for everyone. A thorough health screening and discussion with a healthcare professional is absolutely necessary before even considering it.
Okay, non-negotiable first step. Who are the specific groups that are highlighted as needing to avoid IF?
The sources list several groups for whom IF is contraindicated or requires extreme caution. This definitely includes children and teenagers under the age of 18, as their nutritional needs for growth are high.
Makes sense. Who else?
Women who are pregnant or breastfeeding nursing should absolutely avoid it due to increased nutritional demands. Individuals who are malnourished or already underweight should not restrict their intake further. Also, people who have issues with hypoglycemia, meaning low blood sugar, need to be extremely careful, as fasting can obviously lower blood sugar further.
And what about people with diabetes? You mentioned type 2 earlier, but with caution.
Yes, and the distinction is critical. There's a very significant concern raised specifically for people with type 1 diabetes who rely on insulin. The sources state there are currently no human studies evaluating IF in this population, and the risk of severe, potentially dangerous hypoglycemia during fasting periods is considered substantial. So for type 1 diabetes, based on these sources, it's presented as a strong contraindication. Don't do it.
Okay, a clear warning for type 1.
Right. While, as we noted, there's increasing research showing potential safety and benefits for type 2 diabetes when done under close medical supervision, as medication adjustments are almost always needed. Type 1 diabetes is metabolically very different and carries much higher risks with fasting.
Got it. So anyone with type 1 diabetes, definitely not. Who else is on the list?
Also listed are individuals with certain other chronic diseases. The specifics aren't always detailed, but the point is, any chronic condition warrants a serious discussion with your doctor first. And critically, anyone with a history of eating disorders like anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating disorder, or who is currently being treated for one, should avoid IF.
Why is that?
Because for these individuals, any form of dietary restriction, including timed fasting, can be a major trigger. It can easily exacerbate disordered eating patterns, potentially leading to cycles of restriction and binging, or fostering an unhealthy obsession with food rules, sometimes called orthorexia. It's just too risky.
That makes perfect sense. A very important group to exclude. And there was also a mention of caution for women in perimenopause.
Yes, one source specifically mentioned that women going through perimenopause might need to be cautious, suggesting that hormonal shifts during this life stage could potentially interact with fasting in ways that need consideration, though it wasn't elaborated on extensively. Again, a reason to consult a healthcare provider.
Okay, so clearly that medical check-in is step one, just to see if you're even in a group that could potentially try it safely. But even if someone gets the green light, are there common side effects people should expect, especially when starting out?
Yes, absolutely. People should be prepared for an adjustment period. The body needs time to adapt to a new eating schedule. This initial phase, which the sources suggest might last anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks for many people, can come with some unpleasant side effects.
Like what? What should people brace themselves for?
The sources list several common ones: feeling irritable or hangry, experiencing low energy or fatigue, persistent feelings of hunger, getting headaches, sometimes nausea, maybe feeling more sensitive to cold temperatures, and potentially seeing a temporary dip in physical performance or concentration at work.
That doesn't exactly sound like a walk in the park.
No, the adjustment phase might not be pleasant. However, the sources also make an encouraging point. They note that in research studies, participants who manage to push through that initial adaptation period often report feeling much better afterward. They adjust, the side effects subside, and they often find the pattern quite sustainable because they start feeling the benefits. So the initial discomfort might be temporary for many who stick with it.
Okay, so getting over the initial hump is key.
Yeah.
Assuming someone does adjust, what about the long-term picture? Sustainability is crucial, right? And you mentioned that overcompensation trap again?
Yes, sustainability is a major challenge for any dietary change, and AF is no exception. If it's not a pattern of eating that you can realistically maintain over the long haul, then any weight loss or metabolic benefits you achieve are likely to be temporary and reversed when you go back to your old habits.
Right, the yo-yo effect.
Exactly. And that overcompensation trap is a huge risk factor undermining sustainability and effectiveness. It's this mistaken belief that because you fasted for a period, you've somehow earned the right to eat whatever you want in unlimited quantities during your eating window.
Like I skipped breakfast, so now I deserve this extra large pizza in dessert.
Precisely that kind of thinking. The sources are very direct and clear on this. If your eating periods consistently involve packing in high-calorie, low-nutrient junk food, you are simply not likely to see the health benefits or achieve sustainable weight loss associated with IF.
It completely misses the point.
It really does. The overall quality and the total quantity of the food consumed throughout the week still fundamentally matter. Regularly overeating during your eating window can completely negate the calorie deficit created by fasting and potentially counteract other metabolic benefits, just like we saw in that mouse study where compensatory eating prevented positive outcomes.
So mindful eating during the eating window is just as important as the fasting itself. And what about the muscle mass issue again? You mentioned potential loss.
Right. It's a common concern with any form of weight loss, not just IF. When you lose weight, especially if it's rapid, you risk losing some lean muscle mass along with fat. This isn't ideal because muscle is metabolically active, helps with blood sugar control, and is crucial for strength and physical function, especially as we age.
So what can people do about that?
The sources strongly recommend pairing intermittent fasting with regular resistance training, things like lifting weights, using resistance bands, or body weight exercises. This strength training helps send a signal to your body to preserve and ideally even build muscle mass while you're potentially losing fat.
Okay, so combining IF with strength training is a good strategy to protect muscle. All of these risks, side effects, and considerations really hammer home the most critical point in this entire section, which the sources emphasize repeatedly: the absolute fundamental necessity of consulting with your primary care practitioner or another qualified healthcare professional before starting intermittent fasting.
This cannot be stressed enough. It is absolutely non-negotiable. Before you make any significant change to your eating pattern, especially one that involves scheduled periods of not eating, you must talk to your doctor or perhaps a registered dietitian who works with your doctor,
Why is their input so vital?
because they have your complete medical history. They know about any underlying health conditions you might have, even ones you might not think are relevant. And crucially, they are aware of any medications you're taking.
And medications are key because fasting can affect them.
Yes, significantly. Fasting can alter how your body absorbs, metabolizes, or responds to certain medications. Dosages for things like blood pressure medications, or especially diabetes medications like insulin or pills that lower blood sugar, may need to be carefully adjusted by your doctor before you start fasting to prevent potentially dangerous side effects, like blood pressure dropping too low or blood sugar crashing.
So trying IF without that medical input, especially if you have health issues or take meds, could actually be harmful?
It absolutely could lead to negative health outcomes. Doing it improperly or when it's not appropriate for you can be dangerous. The medical consultation is about ensuring safety and getting personalized guidance.
Okay, message received loud and clear. Step one, always, is talk to your doctor. Now, assuming someone does get medical clearance, they've had that conversation, and they decide they want to try IF safely. Are there any practical tips the sources offer for getting started?
Yes, assuming you've gotten the green light from your healthcare provider, the sources do offer a few practical tips for implementing IF safely. First, try to establish a consistent routine. Having similar eating and fasting windows each day as much as possible can help your body adapt.
Consistency helps. What about drinks during the fast?
Hydration is key during fasting periods. Water, plain sparkling water, black coffee, no sugar, milk, or cream, and unsweetened tea are generally considered fine as they contain virtually no calories. The main thing is to avoid any beverages that contain calories, like juice, soda, or milky coffee drinks.
Okay, stick to zero-calorie fluids. What about artificial sweeteners?
That's an interesting point raised. The sources mention that it might be wise to limit or even avoid artificial sweeteners during the fasting period. There's some ongoing debate and thought that for some individuals, even non-caloric sweeteners could potentially trigger certain metabolic responses that might interfere with the fully fasted state. So maybe best to err on the side of caution there.
Interesting. Even artificial sweeteners might nudge you out of the fast. Good to know. Any other tips?
One final suggestion is related to managing those initial side effects we talked about, like lightheadedness, fatigue, or headaches. The sources suggest that using electrolyte supplements, you can find these as powders or drinks, might help mitigate some of these issues, particularly as your body adjusts fluid balance during the initial stages of fasting.
Electrolytes could help ease the transition. Okay. So wrapping up this section, definite potential for significant benefits, but absolutely comes with a package of risks, potential side effects, is clearly not for everyone, and crucially requires medical clearance and ongoing attention to diet quality. Where does all of this leave us regarding the overall speed of the science on intermittent fasting right now? What's the big picture?
The sources provide, I think, a pretty balanced perspective on where things stand scientifically. They definitely acknowledge the extensive body of animal research, which is often quite exciting, showing many potential benefits of various fasting protocols on metabolic profiles, inflammation, aging markers, and reducing risk factors for various diseases in rodents and other models.
Lots of promise in the lab animal.
Yes, a lot of promise there. But the sources correctly and strongly emphasize that translating these findings definitively and reliably to humans requires much more research. There's a clear call from researchers, echoed in these documents, for more well-controlled, rigorous human trials.
So we've got lots of promising clues from mice and rats, but we really need more solid proof in diverse groups of people.
Exactly. And the sources are quite upfront about the limitations of the existing human research landscape for IF. Many of the intervention studies conducted so far are described as being relatively small in terms of participant numbers, often quite short in duration, weeks or a few months, and using a wide variety of different fasting protocols and study designs.
Which makes it hard to compare them or draw firm conclusions.
Precisely. It makes it challenging to combine results in meta-analyses or to say definitively which protocol is best, or even if the effects are consistent across different populations. Participants in these studies also often have different baseline characteristics, different BMIs, different health statuses, adding another layer of complexity.
That definitely makes it tricky to get a really clear, unified picture from the current human data.
And what about that crucial comparison again? EF versus just standard continuous calorie restriction. Where does the evidence stand on that? The sources reiterate this point consistently. While, as we've seen, some human studies show that AFAF regimens can achieve similar results in terms of weight loss and improvements in certain metabolic markers when compared to traditional continuous daily calorie restriction, assuming the total calorie deficit is matched.
What?
But there is currently little strong evidence presented in these sources to conclude that IF, specifically the modified fasting or TRF protocol studied to date, produces superior weight loss or more profound metabolic changes compared to simply achieving the same overall energy deficit through daily calorie reduction.
So the weight loss itself seems to be the main driver of many benefits.
Weight loss itself appears to be a major, perhaps the primary driver of many of the observed health improvements, like better insulin sensitivity or blood pressure, seen in both IF and continuous restriction studies. The degree of calorie deficit achieved seems paramount.
Which might suggest that maybe the main advantage of IF for some people is simply that they find it an easier or more palatable pattern to follow long-term, to successfully reduce their overall calorie intake, rather than it having unique metabolic superpowers completely independent of that calorie reduction.
That appears to be a very significant takeaway based on the research presented in the sources we've looked at. It's a viable alternative strategy for achieving calorie restriction that might improve adherence for some individuals. However, we shouldn't entirely dismiss the potential unique mechanisms yet.
Like the cellular repair and circadian rhythm aspects.
Exactly. Those potential mechanisms, like stimulating autophagy or aligning eating patterns with circadian biology, suggest there could theoretically be unique benefits conferred by the fasting periods themselves, beyond just the effect on total calories. But proving those additional benefits definitively in humans requires more specific research.
Right. And speaking of those circadian rhythms, the sources seem particularly interested in that angle, but cautious about the human data.
Yes. The animal data showing the importance of aligning eating patterns with the natural activity rest cycle for optimal metabolic function is described as quite strong and compelling. But the sources emphasize that human data specifically supporting this hypothesis, while limited, is perhaps suggestive.
Suggestive, but not conclusive yet.
Correct. The concept of using TRF to impose a clear diurnal rhythm on food intake, perhaps particularly by prolonging the nightly fast, is hypothesized as a potentially simple, feasible, and effective strategy to leverage our innate circadian biology for metabolic health. But again, it needs more rigorous testing specifically in human populations before we can make strong recommendations based solely on that.
Okay, so that circadian timing aspect is definitely a hot area for future research, but we're still waiting for more definitive human proof on its independent effects. What do the sources say is needed from future research to really nail down the effects and potential of IF? What are the big unanswered questions?
They outline a pretty clear roadmap for where the research needs to go. First and foremost, there's a call for large-scale, long-term randomized controlled trials conducted in free-living adults, meaning people going about their normal lives, not just in tightly controlled lab settings.
And long-term means?
Ideally lasting at least a year, preferably longer, to really assess long-term adherence, sustainability, and the persistence of any health effects, positive or negative.
Okay, longer, larger trials. What else?
These future studies need to incorporate more objective measures rather than relying solely on self-reports, which can be notoriously inaccurate. So objectively measuring energy intake, perhaps using doubly labeled water techniques, and objectively tracking sleep patterns and physical activity levels using devices like accelerometers.
Get better data on what people are actually doing.
Exactly. They also need to move beyond just looking at intermediate markers, like cholesterol levels or fasting glucose, and assess actual hard clinical outcomes.
Like whether people actually get sick less often.
Right. Does IF actually reduce the incidence of developing type 2 diabetes over 5 or 10 years? Does it lower the rate of cardiovascular events like heart attacks or strokes? Does it impact cancer risk or recurrence? Those are the ultimate questions. Future research should also make a concerted effort to enroll diverse populations, different ages, ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds, baseline health statuses, to see how IF affects different groups of people.
Because effects might not be universal.
They might not be. And importantly, researchers still need to work out the details of the optimal eye-up regimens if such things exist. What's the ideal length and frequency of fasting? How much calorie restriction is necessary or best on fasting days? Does what people eat during their non-fasting periods significantly modify the effects? And ultimately, can IF truly complement or perhaps even replace traditional continuous energy restriction as a primary strategy for long-term weight management and health improvement? Is it more sustainable for more people?
That's a really comprehensive research agenda. It definitely sounds like the science is still very much evolving, and there's a lot we still don't know for sure, especially about the long-term effects and applicability across the board in diverse human populations.
That's a very accurate summary of the state of play described in these sources. The overall conclusion seems to be that intermittent fasting regimens represent promising non-pharmacologic approaches. They are largely attempts to translate those exciting findings from animal models into practical eating patterns for humans.
Promising, but still translating.
Yes. And while it's clear that almost any IF regimen can result in some degree of weight loss, most likely driven by an overall reduction in calorie intake, and while some studies do show benefits on certain metabolic markers, the human evidence base is still developing, particularly regarding long-term efficacy, safety across diverse groups, and impacts on major clinical outcomes. The potential underlying mechanisms involving cellular cleanup, circadian alignment, and gut health remain intriguing and absolutely warrant further investigation.
So, bottom line from the sources. IF is a promising area, rooted in interesting biology, but requires more robust, long-term human evidence to fully confirm its widespread effectiveness and sustainability compared to other approaches.
I think that captures the nuanced conclusion well. It's a potentially valuable tool, but not yet definitively proven as superior across the board, and its long-term human story is still being written by ongoing research.
Okay, so it's not necessarily the magic bullet or the be-all and end-all that some headlines might suggest, but it's certainly rooted in fascinating science and seems to hold potential if approached carefully, correctly, and sustainably under the right circumstances.
Precisely. The potential is clearly there, and the research is actively progressing, but it requires that critical, evidence-based perspective. It's not yet time to declare it universally superior, and the long-term effects in humans are still being carefully explored.
Right. Okay, well, we have definitely taken a serious deep dive into the science behind intermittent fasting today, pulling directly from the range of sources we gathered.
We really have covered a lot of ground, haven't we? We started by defining what intermittent fasting actually is, distinguishing it from concepts like starvation or just continuous calorie restriction, and touching on its historical roots.
Then we dove into those fascinating proposed mechanisms that metabolic switch to fat burning, the role of ketones beyond just fuel, the cellular cleanup process of autophagy, that really intriguing potential link to our internal circadian rhythms, and even the possible influence on our gut microbiota. Lots going on under the hood.
Absolutely. Then we explored the practical side, detailing the different popular ways people actually do IF time-restricted feeding like 168, modified fasting like the 5.2 diet, the more intense alternate day fasting, and eat, stop, eat, summarizing what the research presented says about each approach, including limitations and potential challenges.
And crucially, we weighed the potential benefits reported in the studies, everything from weight management and improvements in metabolic health markers like insulin sensitivity and blood pressure to potential effects on brain function and maybe physical performance. But just as importantly, we critically examined the other side, the significant risks, the potential side effects during adjustment, the groups of people who should absolutely avoid it, the vital importance of maintaining diet quality even when fasting, and the ever-present risk of that overcompensation trap.
And as we've stressed repeatedly throughout this discussion, based directly on the guidance in these sources, the absolute paramount importance of consulting your own healthcare provider before even thinking about starting intermittent fasting cannot be overstated.
Cannot be overstated. It's essential to ensure it's safe and appropriate for your specific individual health situation, especially if you have any underlying conditions, or are pregnant or nursing, or take any medications.
That medical check-in is the non-negotiable first step, based on all the evidence and cautions we reviewed today.
Absolutely. Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to maybe ponder. Building on that emerging science we discussed around circadian rhythms and the timing of our eating, Given the hypothesis that eating late into the night might be metabolically disruptive, and considering the potential benefits suggested from simply extending the duration of our natural overnight fast. Where are you going with this? Well, could a relatively simple, maybe more accessible step for many people compared to strict IF protocols be just focusing consciously on finishing all food and caloric drinks a few hours before bedtime, consistently? Just aiming for a slightly longer nightly fast, say 12, maybe 13 hours total, including sleep time. Could that be a less rigid way to potentially tap into some of those proposed metabolic and circadian alignment benefits we talked about, even if you're not following a strict 168 schedule or doing multi-day fasts?
That's a really interesting and practical thought to leave people with. The sources certainly do suggest that achieving a prolonged nightly fast is a key component of time-restricted feeding, and they hypothesize its importance for metabolic health, possibly via those circadian mechanisms. While, as we've said, more rigorous human studies are definitely needed to confirm this specifically as a standalone strategy, the idea of simply focusing on avoiding late-night intake and ensuring a longer overnight break from digestion does seem intuitively aligned with the direction much of the science seems to be pointing.
Right. It feels less drastic.
It's certainly a less drastic change than some of the more intensive IF protocols, which could potentially make it more sustainable and accessible for a broader range of people. Always remembering, of course, the caveat we keep repeating. Run any intentional change to your eating patterns by your doctor first, even something seemingly simple like this.
Definitely. Always check first.
Yeah.
But it does make you reconsider those habitual late-night snacking patterns through a slightly different, more science-informed lens, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Something to think about.